I am a psychology specialist student at the University of Toronto. My focus is in memory enhancement and adaptive learning. And it was always my goal to create something that the younger version of me could have watched that creates the entire framework from start to finish of how to overcome procrastination, how to deal with demotivation, how to start and study all the way through without burning out, and the most effective way to do it. This is the video that I wish I would have had as a first year in university. Please enjoy. I can show you how to get yourself to want to study more, even when you're unmotivated. 3 most common problems that students face. Number 1, lack of motivation. Number 2, procrastination. And number 3, burnout. Let's start with lack of motivation. Everybody knows this feeling. So how do we go from this to this? First, you must define what motivation is. And I define motivation as the lack of and desire to obtain something that you don't have. And when somebody says, give me some motivation, what they really mean is remind me how good the thing I don't have yet is so that I want it more. In other words, you're increasing the lacking experience. So how do you motivate yourself to study? Well, you don't. Motivation is the perceived lack of. And therefore, if you have a lot of work to do, as in the work is plentiful, then by definition, you can't be motivated to do it. What's the solution? Well, you need to draw motivation from somewhere else. And where is this somewhere else? Your end goals, and not from the steps to achieve it. You need to remind yourself why you're doing this. But it goes even further than that, because goals are an external motivator, and there's more than one type of motivation. Let me introduce to you the multidimensional motivation scale. So over here we have amotivation, which is a complete absence of motivation. And then we have extrinsic motivation, which is everything that's outside. It could either be push or pull factors. So anything, if you're a mouse, for instance, say you're a mouse, this could be you are trying to get the cheese, right? Yeah, okay. And then also running from a cat. Those are both external, but they're push and pull factors. And then you have intrinsic motivation, which is essentially you are the only person who is motivating yourself to do it. You are acting because it is simply something that you enjoy doing. So how do you get from amotivation to intrinsic motivation? Well, you have to act like the person who has what you want or who you want to become, and eventually you won't have to pretend. Therefore, the motivation comes from figuring out what you want and then becoming the person who can get it. So now that we've covered motivation, let's go to procrastination. This is one that I know a lot of you want, right? There's 2 reasons why you procrastinate. Number 1, unknown energy cost. In essence, your body doesn't know, or your brain doesn't know, how much energy something is going to take. And if it doesn't know something, it reverts to protecting the body. So it won't give you that energy. Number 2 is a lack of perceived importance. Lack of perceived importance, we've all felt this. Things don't matter until you're close to the deadline. So let's cover both. Number 1, unknown energy cost. How can we solve this? 3 ways. 1, you can read all the instructions, right? A lot of us don't even look at the instructions until it's a couple days before the deadline. Number 2, Swallow the Larger Frog by Mark Twain. And number 3, put it in the blender. It's something I added after Mark Twain's. So let's start with read the instructions. For a single task, read the instructions. For multiple tasks, read all the instructions. Yeah, because then you need to do another crucial step, which is to rank things by difficulty. So how do we know what difficulty is? Well, difficulty is the complexity times the duration. And after reading all the instructions, you're going to use this next step in swallowing the frog. Well, what does swallowing the frog mean? Well, obviously we don't want to swallow this frog because it's way too cute, right? But it basically means you tackle the hardest problem first. And so how do you know which one to do? Because there's so many. And it could be time, how much time it's going to take. It could be, how much effort it's going to take within that time. You don't really know. So what do? Well, you just did it, right? You have the difficulty, and that is the complexity times the duration. And so all you have to do is just go down the list of everything that you ranked. And why do we do the hardest task first? This is really what we're trying to ask ourselves here is like, why does this even matter? Well, number 1, there's something that I call de-snowballing. And number 2, avoid task completion rationalization, which is something that a lot of us do. And I'm going to get into both of these in a bunch of detail right now. So let's start with de-snowballing. First of all, what is de-snowballing? Well, if you think about a snowball, it goes from being small to being big when you push it, right? But this line here represents how hard something is because you spent so much time doing it already. And so if you start with the small tasks, you go to the big tasks, well, you're doing the larger tasks when you have less energy because you've already used some. And so de-snowballing is starting with the harder task and going to the smaller one. You can see it'd be much easier to push the smaller snowball up the hill if you've shed some of that snow off, over time, because you're starting with the hardest thing. So you're starting with the large snowball. When you have the most energy, it's easiest to push, and then it kind of tapers off. So that's de-snowballing. Next, avoid task completion rationalization. How do we do this? Well, remember the snowballing scenario. Now we have de-snowballing. This is what it looks like, right? And so in the snowballing scenario, there's something that I call the snow wall. See what I did there? Snowball, snowball. All right, anyway. So on the left of this wall, we have tasks completed, and on the right, we have tasks to do. Now, this is something I need you to pay attention to because it's very important. This is the rationalized work region, where all of us think that we've done a lot of tasks, right? You've done many little tasks. But what happens is that when you get past this zone, right, once you've done all of this, it seems like you have very few tasks left, except you're left with very little cognitive energy and the very hard tasks. So while it might seem like you completed most of the things on your to-do list, the reality is, right, and a lot of us do this, is that we're left with the things that really mattered, that we really should have done. And we just wanted to feel productive, so we did the small things anyway. So that's task completion rationalization. So now we've covered read all the instructions, swallow the frog, let's put it in the blender. I know that was a lot, so just so you remember where we are, unknown energy, right? That's part of procrastination. So put a frog in a blender? No, of course not. This frog is way too cute. You can't do that, right? But hypothetically speaking, if you were to blend up a frog, it would be easier to swallow. You could probably drink it with your nose pinched, right? So if the frog is an essay and it's blended up, let's break it down into the small tasks just like we would for an assignment. So we have walk to your computer, open and turn on your computer, read the assignment instructions, pick a topic, pick a title, write the name, date, and student number, write an outline, find the applicable sources, and write the intro. These are all very small tasks that you could do pretty easily if you're just, breaking it down. There's not a lot of, activation energy to overcome because they're so small. You can just think, oh, well, I could knock that out in like 2 or 3 minutes tops. Easy, boom, done. So how does blending up the task help? Well, it decreases the activation energy like we just said. It also leverages inertia. That is the feeling of keeping the ball rolling, right? You have that progress. You want to maintain the progress, the momentum. And then it also coaxes out productivity. And this is what I want to get into a little bit more. So focus is seduction. It is not abuse. And a lot of us crack the whip down on ourselves. But what happens if you beat yourself up for not focusing? Well, your brain is really good at making associations, and it will train your brain to avoid work altogether. Because if the association is work plus focus, and that's a neutral outcome because most of us don't reward ourselves, and then you have work without focus, that leads to a punishment because you hate yourself now. You don't like that you didn't do work. Well, what happens? If you avoid work plus focus, it's still neutral, but if you avoid work without focus, it's negative reinforcement because you're removing a punishment. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that the conclusion of this is that if you avoid work, which was the only common factor between the two, right? One with focus, one without, now you're avoiding a potential punishment because your brain doesn't know which one is going to happen. So if you sit down to work, it just knows, oh, work, there might be a punishment. I don't know. And if you think about reinforcement schedules, right? The variable reinforcement, similar to a casino when you don't know if you're going to win, right? The same goes for if you don't know if you're going to be punished or not, it leads to learned helplessness, and then you don't want to do the task at all. And so you're literally training yourself to avoid doing work. That's not good. So we need to coax productivity out of ourselves, put it in the blender. So now that we've covered the unknown energy cost, let's go to the lack of perceived importance. This solution is incredibly simple. To increase the perceived importance, All you need to do is assign each part of your blended frog its own deadlines. And what will happen is that you'll end up going from this, which is where your importance goes up over time until you're just barely above this line where you can start working on it because it's actually important enough. Usually that's right before the deadline. This would be like the cram zone. Well, what happens if you break it up and you assign those arbitrary deadlines? Well, now you're left with this. And you spent a lot of time above this line here, right? You're gonna get way more done because it's gonna be way more important more times. So that's lack of perceived importance. That's how you're gonna do it. Just assign arbitrary deadlines to the blended up frog. Now, let's go into burnout. This is my favorite one because many of us have been told that you need to study hard to get good grades. Well, there is some truth to that, but a lot of us assume that hard means more hours spent studying, more hours cracking down the whip. And the reality is this is not true. Studying harder can mean studying more intensely, can be studying more effectively. It doesn't necessarily mean you study for longer. Here's my burnout equation. And I'll present this to you like math. Burnout equals the perceived effort times the hours worked divided by the results minus 1. Well, why minus 1? Well, because you need it to be able to go negative because there's a point where you've done so much work that you can just chill and not get any stress for a long time. Think of it like putting money in a bank. And here's the second part of the equation, which is productivity equals work intensity over hours worked. We're not going to get too into that, but we can get into the other ones. So burnout, how do we decrease it? We can decrease perceived effort or decrease the number of hours worked, or you can increase the results that you get. So how do you decrease the number of hours spent or the effort that you've perceived to put in? Well, there are 3 ways to do this also. Number 1, avoid the gray zone. And this is the gray zone of socializing and working at the same time. And then you can add contrast to your breaks. What does this mean? Well, you want to add contrast to your breaks because you need a stimulus to let your body and brain know that you're no longer supposed to be working, to shut down that sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight, the cognitive arousal, the cortisol response, the stress responses. You need to shut that down, stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. That's when you go home, when you get tired, it's usually because you know home is safe and so you can kind of decompress, right? So you want to make sure that you have contrast. If you just keep sitting at your desk, you're going to be still very cognitively aroused. You're going to be very stressed out because you're doing work, and so the rest doesn't really do anything. The rest is supposed to down-regulate your stress response to allow you to decrease the cortisol, because what happens if there's too much cortisol? I'm going to get a little scientific here. You don't necessarily need to know this, but just understand what I'm trying to explain. When cortisol stays too high, it interrupts the ability for the prefrontal cortex to allow for learning. But essentially it disrupts BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which allows for neuroplasticity. And essentially if you have too much cortisol, then there's not enough of that. It's basically all you need to know. So you need to add contrast to your breaks. And number 3, you need to change locations between work sessions. Why do this? Well, your brain is very good at tracking how much effort that you've given. And so the way it tracks this is 1, by the task you're doing, but if you complete a task, then it can just move on to the next one. But it also tracks it by location, how long you've spent somewhere. If you spent too much time somewhere, it gets comfortable. It stops giving you energy to use because it assumes that you're safe, right? And that's good if you want to down-regulate and you want to decompress, but it's not good if you want to boost more energy out of yourself, right? And so changing locations allows you to experience a new environment. Your body and your brain need to take in more information, and therefore the sympathetic nervous system needs to be upregulated, and you're given more energy to do your work. So that's changing locations. So now we know how to decrease the hours and the effort. Now let's talk about increasing the results. How do we increase the results? Well, this one's actually very simple. I'm going to blow your minds right now. So it simply comes down to how effectively you study. That's it, right? Results, just how much you get out of what you're doing. The pre-grade framework is basically something that I came up with. I needed a procedure because I have ADHD, I'm very scattered, and I need like a set of rules to guide me through everything. pretty much. The P stands for prepare and prime. This is going to save you a shit ton of time when you go into lecture. So prepare and prime is basically, in psychology, there's something known as mental priming. Mental priming is basically when you expose yourself to everything beforehand so that the key terms and the key topics jump out at you. You tend to remember things more when you give it, or when you've seen it before and you give it special attention. So if you can go through the lecture slides beforehand, and you don't need to understand it, you just need to know that it exists. So this would be like the giant bold header, or the smaller headers, or the bolded words. If you know that they're even there, then when the professor says them in class, they're going to jump out at you, and you're going to recognize it. And then when the professor goes over the explanation, it's going to stick much better. This probably saves me like 2 hours of review per lecture just by going over it for like 15 minutes beforehand. So useful. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this, which I can go over later, but that's like the basic step. R stands for reading. Something that a ton of people overlook is that you can pretty much double your reading speed in about 30 minutes for good. So in terms of textbook readings or lecture readings, or literally anything, I think the only thing I wouldn't use it for is reading for enjoyment, because like you don't really want to speed through that. Also, like not like fiction books, it's like there's no point. But yeah, you can like save hours of pre-readings and textbook readings just by increasing your reading speed. There's a few ways to do this. So the first one is, if you're presented with any text, let's say this is like a chapter. This is like chapter 1. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to read the first sentence, because that usually tells you everything that's going on. And then you're going to read the last sentence, because that usually concludes everything. If this is a book and you're like, okay, I want to speed the whole book, we're just going to full send it, right? Just look at the back cover, because that's going to tell you. It's probably going to give you a character name. It's probably going to tell you the topic and the setting. That's a lot of the time, if you don't know the setting, that's really confusing, because it switches, and then you're like, where did this guy come from? So yeah, that's what you're gonna. It's like basically a bigger version of this. If this is per chapter, just do it for the whole book first, and then do it per chapter. In a whole book too, you'd want to read the first chapter and the last chapter. Kind of spoil it for yourself, but then everything in the middle will make a lot more sense. So in the middle here, this is where it gets a little complex, but you can do a lot more with literally zero more effort. So actually less effort. If you were to have, let's say this is word 1, word 2, word 3, word 4, and it goes like this. I'm going to show you a few ways that you can go through this. Each one is going to be faster, progressively faster as we go down. So if each one of these is a paragraph, your peripheral vision is incredibly strong, way better than you think. So a usual person, a normal person, would probably just read it one word at a time, correct? That's probably how you read it now. What you should try to do is just look at every other word, and your peripheral will take in these 2 words also. It takes a while to get used to it, but you don't even need to look. Like if I had a bunch, I'll just use this. If this is a full paragraph right here, when I was first starting, I would just draw a line like this down the page, and I would never look outside of this. You don't even need to. You just start here and you end here, and then you probably go, if this is 15 words, just go like every 3rd word, like 5 times. Like you're gonna look here, 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 and here. And you don't even need to look at, this is gonna be like 3 words here. You don't even need to look at that. Boom, already you cut off like 25% of your time. Then the next thing you're gonna do, so if you're here, this is a little bit more advanced after you've done it, but like after you've gotten used to this, you can start looking here. In between 4 words, so you'll take in all 4 of these at once, all 4 of these here, and the average number of words per line in a book, I think is like 12, or 15, depends on the size of the book, but I think it's like 12 or 15. So this will be 5 looks, or 4 looks per line. So that's already like a 1/4 of the looks. If each look is like, let's say a millisecond or something, I don't know, just random number, 10 milliseconds, right? that means that each line, if there's 16 words, is 16 milliseconds, and if you only look 4 times, all of a sudden it's only 40. So 25% is fast. After you do this, then, let's go down here, you're just gonna start looking here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, boom. Now you're down to 60 milliseconds instead of, let's see, this one would be 4 per line, so 3, 6, 8, 12, so it'd be 120, now you're down to 60. It's already another half, now you're down to 1/8. Then when you get really advanced, I have a video, or a 3 video series explaining all of this. So just bear with me here and then you can go watch that and it'll make a lot more sense. But after you've done this, you'll just start going boom, boom, diagonal. 2 looks, 20 milliseconds, whole page. The key thing here is to never go back. If you don't understand it, don't go back until you've gone through the whole page. And you might think that speed reading, you're like, oh, how do I actually take in everything? They'll probably just look at words, right? It doesn't make any sense. When you read, you actually can't not understand it. If I were to write a random word here, you would take it in no matter what. It's not really an option. So the way to make sure that you actually understand what's going on here is at the end of each paragraph when you're first starting, just ask yourself, what was that about? And if you don't know, use the context of here.
Sorry, it was per paragraph?
Sorry?
It was per paragraph, like after each paragraph?
Yeah, after each paragraph. Just when you're first starting out, and then afterwards just do it for like the whole page. Most pages will probably be like 3 paragraphs, and they'll be like longer. If it's an academic journal or something, it's probably going to be smaller, a lot of citations. Skip over the citations. You don't need that. Unless you do need them, in which case then use them, but otherwise just completely skip over it. And actually, academic journals are easier because they're going to state the hypothesis right at the beginning. And so if you just look at that and then go to the conclusion, you're like, okay, here's what I need to know, here's all the data. And then just like, if you need to draw things from the procedure, take the procedure. But yeah, that's going to save you a ton of time. So, go diagonally. If this is the whole page, eventually you're just going to go boom, 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 maybe start here. And then if there's like another line here, here. Now it's like 6 looks of the whole page. You're just going to go diagonally across the entire page. This takes a while to work out too, and I'm still dealing with this, but I think I went from like a page, like I have ADHD, so I sucked at reading. Like I hated reading, and I would just never do it, so I never practiced. And then I realized that you could speed read. So I went from an average page like this in about 1 minute and 30 seconds to about 20 seconds. The mental priming, you also go through whatever it is you're going to read, especially if it's for lecture. So if you need to read over a bunch of lecture slides and there's some big paragraphs on it, then you're going to want to go and like mentally prime yourself by knowing what it actually is that you're going to be reading about. And again, you'd read the topic, the first sentence, the last sentence, and then go through it all, speed read it. Got it? That way, anything you pick up here is going to make sense in the context of the structure that you already formed in your head mentally. Okay, the next one is engage in lecture. This one's tricky because people are very particular about the way they like to take notes. Usually, this is the way I do it, but you by no means have to follow this exactly. Tailor it to however you want. The prime, for me, that's just reading. I don't really usually make a mind map, but I might start doing that though. It's a good suggestion. And then for engaging in lecture, if you were to have, say, a slide, you have big text like this, and then you have little text like this. Your short-term memory is incredibly limited. It holds about 7 items. This is a lot more than 7 items, and that will not stick in my head, no matter how much I try to memorize it. If I try to write all of the explanations that the professor gives, it might be helpful when I'm looking back, but I'm still going to have to look back, and look back really hard, as in just like basically relearn it and reteach it to myself. So that's no good. We don't want to do that. That takes too much time. I want to sleep. So if you're approaching something like this, the way to categorize this, so there's something called chunking. And chunking basically puts a bunch of information into one chunk of information, and you only have to memorize that thing. So for example, take a phone number, right? 1, 2, 3, Let's say, like, okay, 1, 2, 3, dash 4, 5, 6, dash 7, 8, 9, 0. This is pretty easy to remember because it's split into 3. But if I got rid of this part, you would have, like, let's say they were random numbers and not in order. You would have a really hard time remembering that. 10 random numbers, it's pretty difficult to do. But if it's split up into chunks, it's much easier. So the idea here is to make this entire slide one chunk. And that way you're only trying to remember, it's anywhere from like 30 to 50 chunks instead of like a bajillion. So the way I categorize all of this is just to write down whatever the question is that this information would answer. Because when you're going into an exam, you're basically just answering questions. So to me, it doesn't make sense to study any other way than answering questions. If I know what the question is, then I know that I'm going to have to remember this information. And if I don't know the explanation, I can always look it up. I don't really need the professor for that. I need the professor to tell me what it is that I need to know so that I can go figure it out myself. In high school, they kind of just tell you what it is and then they teach it to you too. They don't do that in university that much. If you have a really good professor, maybe. But like most of the time they'll just tell you what it is. They'll go over a practice problem, be like, now you should get it, and then send you on your way. Let's say this information was talking about the mitochondria, and then this here was like a bunch of bio stuff. The question would be like, what is the function of the mitochondria in the cell? Then all of this is one chunk. You know that this stuff answers what the mitochondria does in the cell. That's all you need to know. And then later you'll go over it and study it, but you don't need to like piece it all together again after the lecture. And this is why if you wait for like even like an hour after lecture, most of it just fades. Do you guys know what Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve is? Okay, I'll explain it. So it more has to do with the frequency of forgetting and how quickly you forget. But you guys know what spaced repetition is? Okay, so Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, if this is time and this is stuff you remember, the first review that you do, let's say you go to lecture, it's going to look like this. This is how much you're going to remember over time. Boom. Pretty terrible. But then as soon as you review it, it's going to look like this. And then the more you review it, the slower you're going to forget until you basically forget nothing. So even if you wait like an hour to do a review, you're missing all of this time here, and you're doing fewer reviews. Because with this one, it's really easy to do a review. You just ask a question, and then you look at the slide, you're like, cool, that answers that. That's one review. Boom, first one, first notch, right here. And then it's very easy to just, if somebody, like if you're studying with people, you know, then you can just ask the question. They're like, okay, blah, 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 and then you explain like the whole slide. But then it will conceptually make sense. You're not just memorizing facts. After that is generate flashcards. This is the memory part. Okay, so I have a few rules. There's Simon's flashcard rules. 1, thou shalt not write by hand. The reason I say this, yes, you might remember it a little bit better, but it's so slow, and you can't do it in lecture. The second one, also like any boost in memory that you're going to get from this is going to be way overcompensated by the amount of repetitions you can do just because you have so many more, and each one only takes like a second. So when I do my flashcards, last year I made and memorized about 13,800, and each one took about 8 seconds to do. So, and I do about 50 new cards per day per class, so about 250 new cards per day, and then 400 to 500 reviews per day. And all of that takes about 2 hours. That's all I study for classes that are purely memorization based. Second rule is use Anki. By the way, Anki, does anybody not know what Anki is? Okay, Anki is a free software that you can get. It's free on Android phones. I think you have to pay for it on Apple phones, but yeah, it's free on all computers too. So if you want to use it on computers, it's completely free. It's basically the software that I use to make all my digital flashcards, and it has a spaced repetition algorithm built into it. So you just make the cards and you study them. You just do what it tells you to study, and it will basically make it so you're reviewing the stuff you don't know more and the stuff you do know less. So every time you get it right, you're going to see it less frequently. And then over time, if you get it wrong, it will restart. The third one is you're going to do 50 new cards per day for class. 50 to 40. It depends on the class. And I will go over this in another, I'm thinking of doing one of these like every week. So I will go over this in way more detail in another one. But because we only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to move fast. Okay, R is for review daily. A is for arrange visually. Your brain is much better at remembering pictures than words. There's a lot you can do with chunking information just in one picture. So if you create a vivid image of a bunch of information, then you're going to remember it a lot better. All you have to do is remember that image. So let's say for the mitochondria, I want to know what it does in the cell. I'll just remember a car driving on the highway and exploding, and then the more senses you can include, the better. So what does it smell like? What does it sound like? What does it look like? How big was the explosion? That kind of thing. Then I know that the mitochondria is basically the engine of the car is the cell. So I can remember that pretty easily. It's a very vivid image for me to remember. You can also make mind maps, and I can go much more into that. Yeah, if you're cramming, that's the way to go. Skip all that and just straight to that. Okay. Also, for arrange visually, you want to have all the flashcards first. You need all the nodes, and then you can connect the nodes with the mind map. D is to drill the content. This is different from review the flashcards, but essentially this is, you're going to redraw your mind map over and over again not until you get it right, but until you can't get it wrong. And I label can't get it wrong. Can't get it wrong equals the 3 threes, which basically means you need to get it right 3 times in a row for 3 days in a row, and then after that you can review it once every 3rd day until the exam. If this is my procedure, feel free to iterate on it. If you get it wrong, start the whole thing over. Basically, that'll make it impossible to forget anything on the exam. And then E is to do exam prep. This is a huge section on its own, and I promise you guys all a freebie. The freebie that I'm giving you is the exact recipe that I use for exam prep. It's different than the 1 hour pre-exam protocol, and it's different from the exam strategy. This is exactly how I actually prepare for the exam, as in like the actual steps. This is like the general approach to studying in school. For now, that's where it's going to be. I also, if you don't know, I'm writing a book. It's called Make School Suck Less, and it will have all of that, all this chicken scratch in it, and the exam prep, but I'm not planning on launching it until September 1st of next year. So it's a long time to wait, and I want you guys to have some value. So yeah, that's it.
Because I used to spend 8 hours a day studying and I got terrible grades. Now I get A's, studying only 2 hours a day, in much harder classes. You can go to UofTearless.com. I cover it all in the video series called the 2-Hour Method. So how exactly do I know if a study method is efficient? Well, here's how I know. I ask myself a very simple question. What would I do if I only had one method to use to prepare for an exam? Would I be prepared? So let's go through a couple examples. Number 1, if you only used notes, would you be prepared for an exam? Probably not. What if you only rewatched lectures? Again, probably not. So what are my favorite efficient study methods? Well, here are some popular ones. I really like spaced repetition flashcards. This is probably 80% of what I do. But the other 20% is self-generated practice questions, full-length practice questions, right? For self-generated, by the way, this is you get another boost of memory called the self-generation effect, where your brain remembers more because you generated the content. And so reading other people's notes is actually really disadvantageous for you because you don't get the self-generation effect. So self-generation effect, practice questions, it could also apply to practice exams, although sometimes you're given practice exams, but if you're not, you can make your own. Blurting method. This is essentially when you talk to anything, the wall, your friend, your stuffed animal, and you just understand where in the explanation process you don't understand what's going on, because articulating your thoughts is another thing altogether than just learning it the first time, right? You can know something really well, you can have a really good cognitive framework, but if you can't, so that's encoding, that's the encoding process from converting information into something that's storable, but then to get it back out, that's retrieval. And that's a whole nother process, and you need to practice that, because if you can't get what you know onto the page, then the professor's not gonna know that you know it. And that's really bad. So, blurting method, really, really good for exam prep. And then finally, mind mapping, which is one that I actually don't use too often, but if there are a lot of concepts that I need to know how they figure out, like maybe pathways of certain biological mechanisms, I might use it for that just to know how they interconnect. But I also like a few unpopular ones. Number one, mental priming. Everybody knows what this is, except nobody actually uses it because nobody wants to do work before the lecture starts. But if you review the lecture and you do it in conjunction with speed reading, right? Then you can go through the lecture really fast. You can pull out all of the really important information really fast, everything that jumps out at you. You know the bulleted terms, you know the main topics. You don't need to know the details right now, right? Because the professor is going to fill those in, but you need to have the foundation, the groundwork to put in all that information and know where it fits. And it will help you understand so much better when you go to lecture. I promise you, it will make a world of difference. So, speed reading and mental priming, those kind of go hand in hand. And then we have semantic visualization, which is essentially when you take the meaning of words and you create an image because your brain is much better at remembering images rather than words. If I were to say the word spoon, right? You don't think of S-P-O-O-N, you think of a spoon because you know what it looks like, you know what it is, right? And so there was one time that I actually used this in London when I was trying to remember the order of the train stops on a certain line, and I just made up a story, a visualization, like kind of a movie of like, okay, there was a king, and a queen on the road, some road, it's like Patrick Road or something like that, and they were having dinner and there was an insect that came down or something, I don't know. It was a very like vivid thing. I was like, wow, that's not something that I would ever experience in real life, so it was very shocking, it was very salient. It grabbed my attention and helped me remember the order of things. Another example, think of the mitochondria. We all know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. If you think of it like it's the engine to a car, now you can think of a car crash, the engine exploded, right? There's fire everywhere. You smell gasoline, you smell burning wreckage. You can hear the crackling of the fire, right? You heard the explosion. You can taste the smoke. It's a lot of senses that you're including, and the more sensory detail you can get, the more ways this information is encoded. So semantic visualing goes further than just visual processing. You can also include all the other senses. And then fourth, we have Simon's 3x3 technique, my personal favorite. What is the 3x3 technique? Well, it doesn't exist, so I'm going to have to explain it to you. Basically, I have something called the 3 3s, which is my definition for knowing when you cannot get something wrong. You know it so well that you can't just get it right, but you cannot get it wrong. How do the 3 3s play into this? Well, I define it as you need to get something right 3 times in a row, for 3 days in a row, and then after that, you can do it once every 3rd day until the exam. And I promise you, you will never forget it, because you will be overlearning, and overlearning makes something incredibly difficult to forget no matter how much time has passed. It's so deeply ingrained, you've encoded it in so many different ways, it's interacting with so many different engrams, which is basically, if you think of like an iPad and then you're writing on an iPad, right? The iPad would be the engram and what you're writing on is the information. So it's basically forming a memory in space. It's like an engram is essentially a group of neurons that hold a specific memory. So there's a bunch of different engrams that interconnect with each other, right? This is hippocampal indexing theory or multiple trace theory. And yeah, they just interact. It makes it incredibly difficult to forget. And if you sustain brain damage, it's gonna be still very hard to forget. You can recover because you have so many interlocking neural pathways. So brain damage, by the way, could just also be fatigue, right? Just not good enough sleep, too many things to memorize, you're just really tired one day, or you're just not, you ate too many carbs before an exam, right? So if you want more details on that, you can just go to UofTearless.com again. And now my question to you is this. What type of study vehicle are you driving right now? Is it a Honda Civic or a spaceship? And I want you to be honest with yourself. Because is there a better way? And if there is a better way, why haven't I looked for it and why haven't I implemented it? 2 years ago, I asked myself these very same questions. I had a really hard time in school in first year. I went from the top of my class in high school to a 37% in my first semester. Awful drop in grades. And I was like, I am not cut out for this. What do I do? Why is my learning so slow? And I realized that I was driving a snail. And let me know if this sounds familiar. In first year, this was the way that I studied. Rereading textbook chapters and lecture slides, rewriting my notes, rewatching YouTube videos, and reading my friends' notes. I'm sure a lot of us do this. And you might feel like I'm calling you out right now, and I am, but only because I used to do it too. So I know what it was like, and it sucks. Because you feel like you're doing a lot, and it really isn't doing that much. Why? Because these are incredibly passive ways of learning. There's no self-generation effect. You're not doing anything with the information after you've done it, and you're literally just rereading something, which is basically just rereading the textbook chapters, but just with less detail. So you need to actually do something with the information, and all of this just prepares you to know what to learn. But it's not the learning itself. It just exposes you. It's essentially all of this is mental priming. You're not even in lecture yet. You're not even studying after lecture yet. You don't actually encode much of this. And that's why in the burnout equation, you put in so many hours because you're doing something that doesn't make a difference, and doing more of something that doesn't make a difference is not going to make a difference. Another question you can ask yourself is, does the difference make a difference? If the difference does make a difference, then you know that it's effective. It was a good change. So Simon's learning speed back then was a snail. So what's the lesson that I learned from this? Don't do this. Do a lot of this. That covers increasing results. So now that we've covered burnout, we go back to our original agenda. We've covered the 3 most common student problems. We're going to go through this really quick and do a quick summary. We've covered the 3 most common problems, which were motivation, procrastination, and burnout. We've covered my favorite solutions to them. So for motivation, that would be figuring out what you want and becoming the person who can get it. For procrastination, that would be unknown energy cost is the problem, and the lack of perceived importance is the problem. For unknown energy cost, the solution is to read all the instructions, swallow the frog, and put it in the blender. And for perceived importance, it's to make your studying look like this and assign arbitrary deadlines to the different components of your assignment. And burnout. How do we decrease burnout? Well, remember, we can decrease the perceived effort and the number of hours worked, or we can increase the results by studying more efficiently. This is my exact framework to maximize studying efficiency and get A's in 2 hours a day. If you want to learn how to apply this to your own classes and my entire exam prep strategy, then you can go to UofTearless.com. That'll be the first link in the description. But let's switch to the whiteboard where I'll show you exactly what it is that you need to be implementing and then how to implement it to 3 different types of schedules. These are the 3 most common schedules that I see that students have. And here's how to fit all of the information that I just presented here in the pre-grade framework into that, what to do when. Let's say example schedule 1, we're going to go from the least busy to the most busy. So least busy would look something like wake up, and then lecture, and then you know, something like this. Obviously, there's probably more than one lecture, but it would look something like this. Maybe you have like a couple of lectures here, and you have in-between time. First year, you'll probably have more lectures than people in 4th year, just because in 4th year, the lectures are way longer. I usually don't have more than 1 per day, but they are 3 hours long. So, and in 1st year, every lecture is an hour. If you have a long one, it's an hour and a half, but you'll have like 2 to 3 per day, and like maybe a lab once a week. So this would be, let's say you go to lecture, right? Let's say this is lecture 1. Well, now you have this like little block time here, or if you don't have a second lecture, then you're just already here.
let's start from the lecture, and then we'll go into a loop and go back down from the beginning. So first, you do all of the mental priming right here. This is the P right here, the P and the R. P plus R. Then you go into lecture, which is the E. Engage in lecture. This could also be the G if you can make flashcards fast enough. It took me a very long time to be able to do this, by the way. Not in a long time, I mean like a year, because I didn't know how to do it. It took me a long time to figure it out. And then after lecture, so let's say either during this break time here or during this time when you're done for the day, now you're moving on to the G, the R, and the A, which is to generate flashcards if you didn't do that in lecture, the review them daily, and then the arrange them visually. So the main thing here is to make or do something with the content. Do something. And this could either be flashcards, mind maps, blurting method, honestly, even like semantic visualization, which, if you don't know what this is, semantic visualization basically means that you're taking the meaning of something and you're creating a visual image because your brain is much better at remembering images rather than words. So, as an example of this, let's look at the mitochondria. Let's say you want to know that that's the powerhouse of the cell, right? Well, the goal here for semantic visualization, and especially with attention, right, is, and even elaborative rehearsal, is you want to add as many senses as possible. As many senses as possible. And as many emotions as possible. Plus emotions. Now, one thing to note on emotions is that it helps you, or it helps increase the chances that something will be encoded, which is elaborative rehearsal, getting something into long-term memory, but it does not increase recall accuracy. So it will improve how much, or the chances that something, like you'll remember something, but it doesn't guarantee an increase in your ability to recall it and recite it on the test, which again, blurting is a way of reciting what you know, right? You can have the best mental structure in the world, but if you can't get it onto paper, nobody's gonna know. And those systems, the recall system is actually a completely different process than encoding. So like this whole part here is encoding, but this whole part here is recall. And what happens here doesn't really affect what happens here. And a lot of the time, on tests, you can actually know something and it can be in long-term memory, but what's blocking is not like an encoding problem. You might actually know it, but what the problem might be is that your ability to recall it is not strong enough. And that, that depends on a lot of things. There's something called state-dependent memory, mood-dependent memory, context-dependent memory. These are all things. So state-dependent memory, if you were angry at the time of encoding and then you're angry at the test, that might actually serve as like a boost, or you're like happy, or even like you're tired or like sleep deprived, or honestly, like even if you're, this is a funny example that one of my professors actually gave, if you're inebriated, like you're intoxicated at the time of encoding, being in an intoxicated state at the time of retrieval will actually work better than being sober, which is quite funny, but I don't recommend you do that. And then there's context-dependent memory, which is a lot of the time I will actually go study in the exam center because I know that I'm going to be tested in the exam center, and then your environment can serve as a retrieval cue. So a cue is anything that allows you to remember or to recall something better. So it will serve as a cue because you'll associate all that information with the location. Then when you go to the location, you'll associate the information with the location. So you'll be able to recall it better. So that's also, it goes into the senses part here. So for semantic visualization, let's say you had, let's say organelles. Okay, so there's a cell, right? So now there's a car here, doing like this. right here. Okay. And this is the cell. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, so think of that as the engine to the car. Vroom, vroom. And this will be the mitochondria. Now, let's include as many emotions and senses as possible. Now you have the car that crashed into a telephone pole, very dented telephone pole. Boom, crashes. There's smoke. There's a big explosion. There's gas leaking out on the pavement here, and so you can smell the gas. Smell gas. You hear the crash. Maybe you can smell the smoke too. And you know that like this is a very vivid image. Now let's include emotions into it. Very tragic, but maybe somebody passed away while in the crash. There was actually an experiment done where there were two groups. So this story was explained to two groups of people, and they were asked to remember it later. The first group, there was an evacuation in a building, and it was because it was a drill. It was a fire drill. And the second was because there was a fire and people got injured. And what they found was that in the group that was told that it was a fire and people got injured, they actually remembered the details of the story a lot better because it had emotion. So it was more likely to be encoded. So that's how you would kind of create this very salient image. So salient basically means attention grabbing of this slide here. So now it's pretty hard to forget. Like once you've imagined all of this, you're probably not going to forget that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, just like the engine of a car. So that would be the doing something in the lecture part right here. And you want to do this as fast as possible right after lecture because you don't want to forget any of the details. You want to include as many details as possible. Details are key. Details are key. Okay. And then afterwards, so let's say you have two lectures. Maybe you want to do one right here in this part and then another review like this right here. So this would be the, let's see, the G, perhaps the G, and then the R, and then the A. Okay. Then after a while, maybe it's approaching exam time later down the semester, and then you do the D and the E here. But we're not really going to worry about that for the daily schedule. You don't really need to know it, like to do the 3-3s for all of it. I mainly just save that part for the practice questions, just to know which topics I know really well and which ones I don't. And I honestly, sometimes I do this every other week, just because it allows me to know that if there were a midterm to like pop up at any moment, I would be solid in the information that I know right now. And so I'll do like a full practice test every other week. But I don't do it every single day. It's way too much and you don't have enough time and you want to have a life too. So that's the least busy schedule. Now we can just build on this and it's going to be a little bit quicker. Second least busy schedule. So medium schedule. This one would be you wake up and then you have some sort of extracurricular. Maybe you have morning practice, you're an athlete or something. And then you have lecture, and then you have lab, then you have lecture, and then you go to sleep. Okay, well, what do you do now? It's pretty much the same thing. You just need to be more efficient with your time. So maybe you wake up early. Again, it depends if you're a morning person or not. So there's a bunch of different chronotypes. If you're someone who's a morning person, it's better to do the easier tasks, or so the harder tasks in the morning. But it also depends on time. So maybe you want to do the medium tasks now because you don't have a lot of time before practice. Otherwise, you have to get up super early and nobody wants to get up really, really early. I'm a very morning person, and I still don't like doing the hardest task first thing in the morning before practice, because it's just too hard to think when I know that there's something, like let's say it's a really hard workout coming up. I can't think about the really hardest thing. So maybe I'll just do like a medium task here. And then, maybe after practice, before lecture, then I'll do the hard task, not the whole thing. You don't need to do the whole thing all at once, and this is something that a lot of people are chasing perfection. You don't need to be perfect, you just need to make progress. Maybe you work on it for like an hour, and then after that, you'll go straight into the mental priming for the lecture. And then right after lecture, let's say it's straight into lab. You don't have any time. Just boom, straight into lab. Okay, well, you can't do review there, but maybe, like let's say you have like 10 minutes of transition time to get from somewhere, right? You're well prepared because you packed all of your stuff and brought it with you to the first lecture. So then you have 5 minutes. What can you do in 5 minutes? Well, you can write down the questions, that we were talking about over here. These questions here, just to make it easier for yourself to review later. And then you go into lab. Then let's say you have no time right after lab. Well, that's fine because there was no new information most of the time. And then you go into lecture. Well, you didn't have enough time to mentally prime. Well, sometimes that's okay, but you could also have done it the day before, after lecture, before you went to sleep here. And then the next day you would be fine coming back here, or you could have done it in the morning. Right there, it only takes a few minutes. And then you have lecture, and then you can do the regular schedule of the G, R, and A right after, right there. And you can do that for both of these lectures here. So that would be the medium schedule. Now the hard schedule, and this is honestly pretty much my schedule, busy schedule. So we'll have wake up, then we'll have practice, and then we'll have lecture, work, practice, and then maybe more work, or another lecture if it's an unlucky day, and then sleep. So I have double practices, which honestly is rough. It also means I have to wake up earlier. So here's what I do to make the most out of my time in the day. I will do all of my mental priming for the day. So this is the P/R before morning practice here. I'm still waking up. I'm on the rowing team for the type of practice, if you want context, and we wake up early, so I can't really do very hard things. I just need to know that I'm doing something productive that will prepare me to make the rest of the day easier, so that I can make the most out of my time because it's so packed. Then I go to practice, then I'm tired, but that's okay because we can work on a medium task here. Medium task. And we've already done the lecture priming, so we're fine there. We make the flashcards in lecture, so that would be the engage in lecture and the generate flashcards. Then we have work, which is all of this, all of the UofTearless stuff. And a lot of those are like scheduled calls or something like that, so it does have a certain time that I need to do it at. And so we either that would be, in between this, I would do some review as well, but that, it kind of depends, or I would finish making the flashcards. Then after work, I go straight to practice. This is on your own practice. So it's a secondary workout, but most of the time it's not on the rowing machine, it's on the bike. So I will bike and do my flashcards. Do flashcards. And in the recording of this, I will pop up a picture of what my bike looks like, but it's quite funny. I have a screen. Essentially, this is my bike here. So big old tires. This is a stationary bike, by the way, but let's say I have, those are the handlebars. And then I have an arm with the iPad here, and on this arm I have a remote control so that I can do all of my work while I can flip through flashcards while I'm studying on the bike, or while I'm on the bike. And then after that, I will go into the mental priming for the next day right here. Or if I have lecture, so like mental priming for the next day here, if I have no lecture and it's just work, or I'll do the mental priming for this lecture if it is another lecture on that day. So on Thursdays, I have 2 lectures. I have one from 1 to 4, and then, from 2 to 5, and then from 6 to 9. So it's a very late night. And then after that, I will not, I'll do the G again, make sure that I finish all the flashcards, and then go to sleep. Or I will do some mind mapping for the previous day, for the previous lecture. So this would be like the arrange visually here, if it needs to be done, and then save the rest of the G for the next day. Because so if this was a Thursday, then on Friday I don't have classes, so I can pretty much spend the whole day just making flashcards and reviewing flashcards, making mind maps, and doing all of this stuff here. We're going to be reverse engineering the perfect exam strategy. We're going to go over the different types of questions. This will be topic number 1. Topic number 2, how to approach each one. And then topic number 3, we're going to be covering 3 different examples of exams and then how I would go about approaching these. Let's dive right into the different types of exam questions. So on a typical exam, there are MCQs, so multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and then there are LAQs, which are long answer questions. So for multiple choice questions, MCQs, I want to first focus on how to guess the answer if you don't know. For multiple choice questions, they're usually going to ask you in a few ways. There's going to be obviously like 4 to 5 different answers. This is going to give you, something to go off of at least, unlike the SAQs and the LAQs where you're not really going to have much to go off of. So this is kind of recognition rather than pure active recall. In the multiple choice questions, here are a couple things to keep in mind. 1, if 2 questions are exactly the opposite, one of them is usually right. The second thing to keep in mind is that for any words that are very strong, if they are included in one of the questions, it's unlikely that that question is going to be correct. So words like always, or never, or guaranteed, definitely. These words, if you encounter them, then they are unlikely to be in the correct answer. Words that have, let's say, like mostly, probably, most of the time you'll see likely. These words are not very definitive. And when you see them in a question, it is more likely that that question is right because it purposefully leaves room for error. If they weren't expecting you to think that it would happen most of the time, then they would just say it could. So that one is probably going to be correct. And then the final thing is that when you go through multiple choice questions, the worst feeling in the world is looking back and saying, oh man, I just changed my answer to the wrong one. How do you avoid this? Well, this is the way I do it, is that the first choice is always correct in my head. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually correct, but when I'm going about this, it is absolutely 100% actually the correct answer. And then second is if I go back, I have to prove this answer wrong. There's a lot more to choice than just conscious choice. There's actually a lot to be said for your subconscious, and your subconscious is responsible for a lot of physiological changes. So they actually did a study that was very, very interesting where a bunch of people were taking a test and they were relating, I believe it was different types of faces. But when they were choosing the wrong answer, the body actually produced the same physiological reaction as lying. Whenever you're going back, you don't have that initial gut reaction, right? You only know consciously what you're thinking. And so if you're relying on only conscious, think of this like an iceberg, right? So this is like under the water. There's actually a lot more subconscious than conscious. And so you want to rely mostly on your subconscious for the first choice. And, obviously you're going to do your best here to just make the decision. But then when you go back, it's based only on the conscious. And so you are overcoming a much larger probability of it being correct. And so you have to be able to prove that wrong, because everything will seem correct when you go onto the exam and you take the test and you want to go back and fix your answers because you're not sure. Your gut is going to tell you something and it's going to increase the odds in your favor. Let's move on to short answer questions. Short answer questions, they're much more straightforward, but they kind of act like bullet points that you have to connect with filler words. The reason this is harder, I believe, than a long answer question is because you have to be way more succinct. You know how you try to like write everything out and you're like, okay, maybe somewhere along the line I'll end up hitting the answer. You don't have space for that. Be succinct. For LAQs, which is long answer questions, I would argue is much easier to approach in more of a mind map sort of way. So I'll explain what this means after I go through all of these types of questions, and I'll show you how to make a mind map for. So mind mapping, it's either going to be argumentative or persuasive. These are the two types of essays. So long answer questions are essentially essays. I want to talk about the mind mapping approach here for the LAQs. And honestly, it also works for the SAQs. I like to do something called the point spread. And this is essentially, you start at a point here and you go outward. And this is how you're going to structure an argument or persuasion. One of these two right here. So how does this work? What does point spread mean? And how can you use it to make really strong arguments? When you have a point, what is the point and what is the spread, right? We need to define what those two elements of this mind map are. The first element is the point, and this is going to be your topic. It's from the center. So essentially it's spreading outwards. The spread would be what comes after it. So this is the example that I like to give every time because it's very simple and people understand it. So the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, but your topic, let's say that the question asked something like, explain the role of the mitochondria, the role of the cell, and then how it differs from another organelle, which we also have to explain. These are the four components. We're going to hit them one by one. So the topic here, the point, this is going to be the cell, not the mitochondria, because the mitochondria is part of it. Then we're going to have the types of cells, so animal cells and plant cells. Obviously, there are different components of cells. So let's say that this is the organelle component. And then in the organelles here, we have mitochondria and we have chloroplasts. And then here, we have mitochondria. Now that we've made this mind map, and this is how I would study it, I wouldn't necessarily write this out on the exam. It takes too much time, but you should understand on a fundamental level that this is going to be the structure of your argument when you're writing short answer or long answer questions. Your response would be something like the mitochondria. So start by addressing, right, the role, right? This would be number one, is define it, and organelle, and that hits this part here. So you're actually kind of going back. So this would be 4, this would be 3, this would be 2, and this would be 1. And it would also look the same here. So these would both be 4. This would be 3. This would be 2. And this would be 1. So when you're thinking from the topic, that's the order 1, 2, 3, 4. But when you're making your argument, you go 4, 3, 2, 1. So the mitochondria is an organelle. And so we just covered mitochondria. We covered organelles. And then we have types of cells. So in which cell is it in? Animal and plant cells. And then we have to explain how it's different, right, from the organelles of plant cells. Whatever the question is asking, the role of the mitochondria, right, you first have to define what the thing is. And then you go and say it's in the cell and it's different from the other stuff. And then you can say its role. So mitochondria is an organelle in both animal and plant cells. Its role, or the role of the mitochondria, we'll just say for simplicity's sake here, because I don't feel like defining all of it, it's to be the powerhouse. Now you've defined the characteristics, so that was part 5 here. Now you have to define how it's different from the organelles of plant cells. Unlike the chloroplast, and you'd also have to define this too, and then say which is only present plant cells, ... explain how they're different here. And that is how you would go about building a mind map to form an argument for the SAQs and the LAQs. It's much more just hitting bullet points. And then for the LAQs, you would want to expand after this. So obviously you have this here, but you also want to, add your own thoughts, because you're supporting your argument. You're either making an argument, right? So you're not just saying the facts, but you're giving your own interpretation, or you're trying to persuade someone that your idea is correct. So that's what comes after this, would be like your beliefs, your understanding of the topic, that sort of thing. So for only MCQ exams, a very structured way of doing this, because it keeps my ADHD brain from just running all over the place. I actually go through it twice. I don't go through it once. And I know you might be thinking, okay, I have to go through this more than one time, right? But multiple choice is really tricky in that they try to phrase the questions in a way that's going to make you make a mistake, because they're already giving you a list of answers. And so there's only two ways you can mess up. One, you can misunderstand the question. And the second way is that you just don't know the content. The not knowing the content is solved by studying better, which I've covered extensively in other videos, but I will also cover in later live streams. I'm planning on doing several hours today. So stick around, because I might answer a lot of your questions. And if you have any more questions, drop them in the chat, because I will be looking through that and just blazing through as many as possible after I get through this topic. So the way that you go about solving misunderstanding the question is what I call back, front, back. You go through the test 2 times. The first time, trial 1, it goes like this. You go back to front, and this part is crucial, that you write it on the Scantron only. Why is that so important? The reason for this, well, I guess it makes sense actually if I would explain it after this next step. So we'll cover that in a sec. And the second time that you go is front to back. And this one is done on the test booklet only. So why do I do it this way? Why do I order it this way? It could be done anyway. Why this? Well, first of all, when you go from back to front, most of the time, the professors are going to order the questions in a way that goes from the least, or the furthest recent material, the least recent material, to the most recent material. So odds are you have not spent as much time studying the types of questions or the content for the last few weeks of the semester. So you've had less time with it, and therefore you should spend extra energy and focus on it when you have more energy, which is first, because it will likely be at the back of the test. So you go back to front. Why do you do, well, also on the beginning of the test, they usually give you a couple gimmies. And so a gimme is basically like a very easy question that they expect you to be able to ask. A lot of the time it's been like for my, one of my biology courses, it was like what is ecology? And it's like so simple, but like I guarantee you like half of the people got it wrong because they just didn't make that a flashcard, and they're just like, it's so simple, it's too easy to study. But those are the types of questions that would be like maybe the first or second on the exam. But because they're easier, it means you don't need as much energy. And so you go from the hardest question when you have the most energy to the easiest question when you have the least amount of energy. And it looks something like this. This is something that I call snowballing. So this curve represents how difficult it is for you to complete a task. And when you start with the small things, the easier things, and you go to the larger things, I think it's very easy to tell that it's going to be a lot harder to push this snowball up the hill when it's steeper. In contrast, when you start with the harder thing and it gets easier, the perceived effort might be harder in the beginning, but it remains almost constant over time because things get exponentially harder, but it gets exponentially smaller as well, exponentially easier, or the types of questions get easier. So that's what I refer to as reverse snowballing. So after you've gone back to front, which is what I recommend you do first, you do it only in the Scantron sheet. Why only in the Scantron sheet? 2 reasons. 1, because you don't want your annotations and your choice that you can see when you go back through it again to influence what answer you decide to choose the second time, because you're going to have a lot of bias if you just write it all on the same page and then you reread over everything you've done. You're like, oh yeah, I got that right. Yeah, I got that right. You're going to get something called confirmation bias, which is where you're looking for why your answer is correct instead of evaluating the whole question again without bias. Obviously, you're going to remember some of what you put the first time, but it's going to be a lot less. So it's a way of minimizing the amount of bias that you have. Now, why do I have you do it in the Scantron sheet? The second reason is because you don't want to run out of time. And I've made this mistake many times where I've done it in the booklet first and then scrambled to write it down in the Scantron sheet when I got to the end. Horrible. It's much better if you just write it in the Scantron sheet the first time. You blaze through it. You just base everything on instinct, like I explained earlier about the subconscious and the conscious. You have that boost of subconscious when you're going through the first time in your initial reaction, whereas you don't when you try to reevaluate entirely consciously the second time. It's much better to get everything down on the page so that if time runs out, you can just hand it in and you're only left with the fact that you just haven't gone through the whole second time, but it's on the booklet, so it doesn't matter. You don't have to fill anything in, right? You're not being graded on that. You just didn't get to review maybe the last like third of the test. It's a much better way of staying calm, because if you do it the other way first, you're going to be scrambling and you're going to be worried about what to write in the Scantron. Do I put the right answer or the second answer that I got? No, you just already have all the first answers. They're there, and then you have to prove them wrong because, again, like I explained earlier, you're only evaluating with conscious, so everything will seem right. You have to be able to prove your initial answer wrong. So those are the 2 reasons why I recommend doing on the Scantron sheet only. Then the second time, you go front to back. You're going to start with the easier questions. I would honestly recommend taking maybe like a 2-3 minute break between. It's going to seem like you're just wasting time. But the reality is your brain has a very limited amount of energy. And there's something called synaptic depletion. So in your brain, you have all of these neurons, right? Blah, 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 blah. That's a neuron. There's its axon. There's the axon terminal branches. And then you have more neurons like this and axon terminal branches. Okay, this is neuron 1. This is neuron 2. For this part right here, you can barely see that, but imagine we're zooming in now, so it looks like this. Here. And they're passing along different neurotransmitters. So the flow is going this way. This is N2. This is N1. Okay. So when you pass along neurotransmitters, which are the chemical signals that allow neurons to communicate, you get to a point, there's something called synaptic depletion. And synaptic depletion basically means that you run out of these neurotransmitters over time and you can't produce as much signaling. Oop. Sorry about that. Okay. And you can't produce as much signaling. This is what mental fatigue is short term. It's a form of habituation, if you want to think of it like that too, where you just stop responding to the same stimulus as much. So to avoid that, take a break. This is all to say scientific reason for why you take a break. Yes, this is called the synapse right here. So it might seem like a waste of time, but if you don't do this, you just continually deplete. You need to give your brain a little bit of time to recharge. And it's kind of like a battery. So imagine a phone battery when you're recharging. It actually recharges a lot faster from 0 to like 50 or to like 80 than it does from 80 to 100. Not because it does that thing where it like waits until it expects you to pick up your phone in the morning and then like boosts up the rest of the charge. The reason is because if you were to have two containers, one container is here, one container is here, you have a ton of stuff here. So let's say this whole thing is the phone battery, and to recharge you need to get all of these little dots over here, right? And it's completely full, there's a ton of them. Well, at first it's very easy to just shove these things in here because there's not as many, but over time when it gets more full, there's less and less room, and it's harder and harder to pack those things in. So going from, say, 80 to 100% battery would actually take you almost as much energy as going from like 20 to, I'm just making these numbers up, but like 20 to 80, right? Just way, way more energy. So like well, I'm not going to explain what chargers do. It's just a whole other thing. But this is basically to say, in those 3 minutes, your brain can actually recover a lot. But another 3 minutes after that, it's diminishing returns. So you don't actually need like a 30-minute break. A 3-minute break will do fine to get you through the second half of the test. And plus, it might be further than half of the way through the test because you spent most of the cognitive energy doing this the first time. And then the second half is just review. You've already pre-exposed yourself to it, so you have that mental priming effect, and it's going to be easier. So I'm just going to erase this real quick just so we have more room here. That is how I'd recommend going through a multiple choice question or a multiple choice exam. Back to front, front to back, Scantron first, booklet second. When you don't have matching answers, so if answers don't match, pretty simple, just accept the first choice as correct and prove it wrong to change answer. If you can't think of a reason why it's wrong, don't change it. You're probably just going to be changing to the incorrect answer. It's not enough to think that the other answer is correct because it will all seem correct. You can probably justify all of them in some sense. That's actually not something that you do during this. So the question for anybody who can't see the chat is about LAQs and SAQs. In the exam, the time is limited and there are more questions. So how can we do it faster? The whole mind mapping process. You don't actually do the mind mapping part in the exam. That would be how you would study structuring the information. So I would recommend having a few topics that you cover that would make for good mind maps. So in biology, you could do something like geology, like the carbon cycle, maybe. And then maybe you have one for the nitrogen cycle, and then the phosphorus cycle, and then weather patterns, and then climates, and then perhaps cells, right? You could even do one separately for animal and plant cells. Right, and you just practice breaking this information apart because it's going to really help with the speed. You don't want to have to recreate this on the exam. You want to have it in your head so you can just kind of regurgitate it. And then, you can do a lot during the exam, a lot of processing and figuring things out along the way, but you want to at least have the framework there. So that is for MCQ exams. Now let's move on to SAQs plus MCQs. How do we go about approaching this? The first thing that I forgot to mention for the multiple choice questions is the fact that you should always do a brain dump, a complete brain dump of everything that you think that you're going to forget as soon as you get into the exam. There is a lot to be said for how much you can shove into short-term memory. Your goal is to not forget that. So write it down on a scrap sheet of paper. If you don't have a scrap sheet of paper, then write it down in the margins, because even if you will remember it, you don't want to have to use the cognitive energy to, recreate that memory while you're going through the test. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It's much easier to just write it down. A lot of the time, even if I know what something means, I will literally write down the simplest definition that I have memorized. And then I'm asked to define it later, I don't have to think about, oh, how do I define this? Like, oh, I think it's like, it's probably something like, it's like, no, I have the answer, here it is, blah, 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 blah. I just rewrite it, right? You don't want to have to do all of that stuff. So very powerful tool, write things down in the margins. And before the exam, you know, I have my whole 1 hour pre-exam protocol. It's free. It's a free PDF. You can go download it on UofTearless.com. But essentially part of that is maximizing short-term memory. So before I go into the exam, I will look at all the questions, all the topics. Usually they're only like 5 or 6. Like maybe it's like a list of things, like 5 or 6 lists of things. I'll make acronyms for them, memorize those acronyms, and go into the exam and write them down as soon as I get there. I don't write my name down on the scan sheet. I don't like fill out any of the bubbles. I literally, the first thing that I do when I sit down is I just brain dump all this. I don't even look at the questions. I don't even look at if I need it, because it will help and serve as a memory cue. If it's not needed, it's still good to have as much information about the course as possible there, because it can trigger other memories. So a memory cue essentially is something that helps you remember a certain memory. But a lot of the time we encode all of these things in a similar context, right? We're learning everything in the same classroom, so they're connected that way. But they're also similar topics because it's the same course. And so the more information about a topic you can get in front of you, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to fill in the rest of that information. Because what happens is you trigger an engram, and an engram is essentially a group of cells, a group of neurons that a memory has been mapped onto. So imagine it's like you're like, okay, this is a horrible example because memory is not at all like a video recording, but let's say you just had a video recording, you uploaded it to the cloud, and then your job is to like download it again, right? That would be the recall part. It's, you know, when you activate the engram, that's essentially the programming in the computer that tells it to download the memory from your storage. So the more of those cues you can get, right? It's like it's a stimulus which triggers the response, which lights up. It's like plugging in a Christmas tree, right? You put in the teeny little plug and then the whole thing lights up. And then you're like, oh my gosh, that's a Christmas tree, not a normal tree. Right? You're seeing it in the dark. You're like, oh, it's just a normal like pine tree. No, it's a Christmas tree. Now you can see that it's lights, right? Now that you've plugged it in. That's kind of like that. So you want as much stuff there as possible. So let's move into MCQs and LEQs, that type of exam. How do you go through this? Sorry, there's one more question. Wouldn't it be good to, like, before approaching the question, to make a few points about the answer and how I'm going to write quickly to make this structured? Yeah, you're getting ahead of me here. So I'm about to go into my strategy for that. So multiple choice and short answer. What do you do? Pretty much exactly what you just said, actually. So the first thing I do, right? So we have the brain dump. And then you go into the SAQs. I'll usually on a scrap sheet of paper, just write down the number of the question, and then everything I can remember that relates to that, bullet points, definitions, anything that will help me answer that question. I don't format it in any way. I literally just write down as much as possible on scrap sheet. Again, if you don't have scrap sheet, you can just make teeny bullet points in the margins to not try to take up as much space as possible. So you'll plan SAQs. Then third, you will go back to front, MCQs, and then you will go SAQs. You will actually write the SAQs, so actually write. And then if you have time, you can go front to back, MCQs. That is how I would approach the MCQs and the SAQs. Now let's move on to the third type of exam, which is MCQs plus SAQs plus LAQs. The first thing that I would always do is brain dump. Then plan out the SAQs. Plan the LAQs. Why do I have you plan the SAQs first? Well, the reason is because it covers more topics. And the more you can think about more topics, the easier it's going to be to think in depth about one. And while it is probably not the same topic as an SAQ, you are more likely to, again, retrieve the information if there's a greater context to draw from. So that's why I always recommend doing the SAQs first. It will help with the brain dump. You're essentially brain dumping even more. And then the LAQs, you need to be a lot more structured in your planning. You can't just write random garbage. I would at least attempt to plan in order of the way you're going to write it. Okay, then fourth, you're going to do the MCQs. You're going to go back to front. Fifth, you're going to write the LAQs. Why write the LAQs? Because it's that big snowball. It's what takes a lot of mental energy, and it's worth the most points. And you want to be able to think very clearly so you don't end up rambling and write way more pages than you need to. You want to be able to keep it succinct, because the SAQs will force you to be succinct because there's not a lot of space. But the LAQs, you have a lot more freedom to write as much as you want. But you need to be clear. I promise you, if you write a bunch of mumbo jumbo, the TA will get very frustrated. I have a lot of friends who are TAs, and they hate it when students just write a bunch of garbage hoping that the answer's in there. And a lot of the time, they will just mark the answer as wrong because it's too hard to find the points that they're looking for, even if it might be in there and just not explained well. So it's more important to be clear and not write a lot than it is to try to write 3 pages and hope that your answer is in there somewhere. So write the LAQs. Then number 6, write the SAQs. This honestly is where I would recommend taking a tiny break, 2 to 3 min break. This dash here just means minute. Okay, write SAQs. And then if you have time, you go front to back MCQs. And that is it. In this video, it is my goal to give you the best advice that nobody gave me when I was a first year, second year, even third year, and now as a fourth year, understand the actual psychological principles behind locking in and getting focused, and how to do it on command, and how to decrease the perceived effort of work. We're going to start with why you can't lock in and the approach that you need to take to start locking in, and then the next video I will show you how to do it. But it will not make sense to you unless you watch this video all the way through. So let's get started. Why can't you lock in? Every time you go into a classroom, into the library, you say, all right, it's time to lock in. This is the semester. I know I've heard every single one of you say it, but nothing changes. Why is that? From a psychological perspective, or even just from a behavioral perspective, you need to change something. Learning is defined as a stimulus. Let's say this is the stimulus, and it is responsible for a behavior. So in the process of learning, what you're actively doing is you're changing the response. This would be R2, so this is response 1. You're changing the response that comes when you trigger or present this stimulus. And the faster you can do this, that defines how intelligent you are. So how do you lock in? Well, locking in is just a matter of focus and doing work, right? Locking in is doing the work that you know you need to do. And so how can we get ourselves from a behavior point of view to do work, right? We have to define what this is. This is doing work. So what is the preliminary step for doing work? Well, the first thing is you need to know, 1, what do you need to do? And then you need to determine how long this is going to take, or if you have time, if you have the resources to complete the work, right? Okay, so this would be yes, then good, you're good to go. If you don't have the resources, no, then you need to get the resources. This is another subsection, so do you know what resources you need? If the answer is yes, you're good to go, because now you can go get them, right? There's a question of access here, but for simplicity's sake, right, you're a student, you're studying, it's not that hard to get certain resources, you just ask, right? You just need to know that you need to ask. If you don't have the resources, no, then do you know anyone who might know, right? Do you know how to get the resources? If the answer is yes, then just go ask, right? That's the same thing as here, go get them. But if the answer is no, then ask somebody who has done what you have done before. Look at other successful people. This is arguably one of the fastest ways to learn. Very important though at this stage is that you define the success at the stage that you're at, because you don't want to do the same thing as somebody who's miles away from you, because they're operating a completely different playing field, right? It's the same thing as if you were a preschooler trying to, do the work or study like somebody in university. There's no point. The work is not the same. It's not the same caliber. So you need somebody who's successful, but right ahead of you. Third is now implement them. Let's say you were trying to get a computer or a pencil or a pen or a piece of paper, right? You can't write notes without a piece of paper or like an iPad or something, right? Once you have them, implement them, right? Start taking notes, start actively doing the work. So this is what allows you to have the ability to lock in. But now let's think about the psychological perspective. Okay, I know how in theory I can, but I don't want to. What do I do when I don't want to? How do I study when I don't know how to study? Well, that's a very good question, right? Now it comes down to the mental aspect. So 4, the ease of implementation. How do you make locking in easier? How do you make doing the work easier? Well, there's a few ways you can do this, and it kind of just comes down to the way that you manage stress in general. The first thing is get more resources, right? The more resources you have, even cognitive resources, right? The ability to handle problems because you've had prior experience or you've read how to do it or something like that, right? That is a mental resource. You can also have physical resources, right? That's mainly these parts, but the mental resources is also a huge factor. The second thing is make the work easier. So how do you do this? Well, you can break the work down. You can decide what work actually needs to be done and what doesn't, because a lot of work just doesn't need to be done. A lot of people spend a lot of time doing the things that don't actually make a difference. So the question here, does the difference, locking in, make a difference? Right? Are you doing the work that's worthwhile to do in the first place? That's a very big question you need to be asking yourself. Number 5, it's what's the stimulus? And not only that, but what was the original response that you're trying to change, right? Because you're trying to lock in. So whatever you're doing is not working. So we need to define the previous experience or previous response, and also what is the new response that you want to happen, right? You can't just say doing the work. I want to do the work. What does that mean? Define it, right? I want to open up the laptop. I want to write my student number, my name, the due date. I want to start writing the first paragraph, start writing the second paragraph. I want to find the evidence in articles, in journal articles. I want to sit down and go with this lecture. I want to go through 5 slides today. But more importantly, keep in mind that when you were learning, you can only have one stimulus for one behavior, because if you have more than one behavior, you don't know which one to do. And so you can't just have okay, if I'm trying to lock in for reviewing a lecture, right? Maybe I go to the library, this specific spot, I sit down, I open my laptop, and somebody comes over and says, Simon, start studying the lecture, start this slide. Boom, now I'm going to start the slide, right? That is the stimulus to go, right? It's much easier to be told something to do also, but that's just if you have really good friends, they'll do that with you in the library, right? But yeah, so that's one stimulus, but it's only gonna work for me studying lecture. If somebody says, go study the lecture, and I'm like, oh, well, do I want to go over the slides? Do I want to rewatch the lecture? Do I want to do the flashcards? Do I want to make a mind map? What are you doing, right? So maybe you need to be even more specific. Study the lecture slides. Study the lecture flashcards. Study this class's lecture from today, right now. Be even more specific, because the more specific you get, the better a response you get, and the faster you're going to make that association. So get specific with your stimulus. Most of you have never been specific in your life. Okay, you need to be extra specific. You are a dog, Ivan Pavlov's dog. You are his dog. He is presenting a stimulus, a classical conditioning. He is ringing the bell, and you are salivating to the food, right? You need to treat yourself like a lab rat. You give it one stimulus. You get one behavior. If you don't like the behavior, you give the stimulus, and you have in mind what the behavior is that you want to change, because if this is previous behavior, right, let's say this is the previous one right here, you don't want this anymore. You want to get rid of that. Well, you can't just have a stimulus and then have it disappear, have the behavior disappear, right? That's called extinction. But the way to get this extinct is to present this without doing this, without the middle steps here, right? But it's much easier if you just say, I want to do this instead, right? Then you're learning. You're replacing the behavior. So you present this stimulus again, right? Maybe you do this one twice and then you forget and you do this once, right? But over time, you're going to do this and this and this and this again and again and again and again, and then you will have learned. And the faster you can do this, maybe it only takes you one try. You're very intelligent. But so many of us, we just said we want to lock in. We present the lock-in stimulus, right? Okay, Simon, lock in. And I just sit there and do the same thing I always do. And so what does that tell me? Well, I'm reinforcing the behavior that when I say lock in, or when I say I just need to chill grind, right? Somebody presented that term to me a while ago, but like chill grind, I don't even know what that means, right? But like I just need to chill grind, or I just need to lock in. Those are two stimuli for the same behavior. And there's a phenomenon in psychology where if you have one stimulus that codes for one response, and then you present it with another stimulus at the same time, like after this has been conditioned, right? So this has already been conditioned, then all of a sudden you start presenting 2 to 1. This stimulus right here, it will have no impact, right? And so then all of a sudden I'm thinking, right? Because the second one, I've already done the chill grind, but the second one is Simon lock in. And so all of a sudden, I have both of these stimuli. I have the Simon lock in and the Simon chill grind, right? Both of them mean the same thing, but only this one is going to even matter. Or I'm just going to put this one and it's going to have the same result as that was conditioned here, when in reality, you want the response 2, right? You want the lock in. This is the lock in response. But because you're presenting it with the same stimulus, you're associating it, but it's not going to make a difference. That is why you need to have a different stimulus, the lock-in stimulus, for a different response than the chill grind and the chill grind response. This is the way that you're going to have a stimulus change. You're actually going to be able to lock in. This is the foundation of learning. But one thing to keep in mind, I said I'd come back to number 4, right? The ease of implementation. You make this as easy for yourself as possible. In physics, if you think about 2 systems, one system here, and they interact with this system here, right? Let's say this one is like bananas, okay? This one is apples. And you think about the total volume of food, right? If you combine both of them, there's going to be more bananas than apples. And so the combination of food, it's going to be mostly apples. And the larger system is going to have a greater effect on the smaller system than the smaller system will have on the greater system. In other words, if I have $100 and I lose $1, it doesn't matter that much. But if I have $2 and I lose $1, that's 50%, right? That's half. So yeah, it's going to have a much bigger impact. And so the ease of implementation, right? You think about yourself. You are small. This is me, right? Little smiley face here. But this is my environment. This is the library, right? This is the bar. This is the frat house. This is the classroom. And so the easiest way to influence the system, the smaller system, you are the smaller system. You are never going to overcome the environment because the system that you're in is too great, right? If I were to breathe out as much as I can in this classroom because I want to heat up the room, it's not going to make much of a difference because the air temperature is, it's set, but also because the room is so big, right? And so I'm barely going to have an effect on this air temperature here. Whereas if I were to just open the window, the outside comes in, it gets cold in here. Influence the system, change the system that you're in, the environment, change the environment. You change the environment, it will influence you. It will make it easier. You surround yourself by people who are smarter than you, that work harder than you, that go to the library every single day. You always go to the library, you always study with smarter people. I guarantee you 100% you'll get smarter. I guarantee that you will lock in more, right? Because if you're surrounded by people who always lock in, one of the basic psychological needs is relatedness. And if you stand out from them, you're not fitting in with the tribe. You are isolated, right? People want connection. And so to fit in, you have to adjust to their standards, right? If they're a bigger system, your friend group is a bunch of hard workers, right? And they're all super smart and you're down here, right? Maybe you don't work as hard. Maybe you don't study as hard. Maybe you haven't learned as much as them, right? By the way, anyone who's smarter just means that they've learned more over more time, right? It doesn't mean you're dumb. It's just like anybody can learn. That some people make associations faster. That's intelligence, but it doesn't mean you're smart, right? Because you can be really intelligent and dumb. It's like a speed thing versus a knowledge-based thing, right? So, okay, let's say you have a bunch of friends. They're all really smart. They all work really hard. You're down here. If you always hang around those friends, you're going up. The easiest way to make yourself work harder, change the environment. This is a 3-step system on how to actually lock in. We basically talked about the approach that you need to take in order to lock in. Manipulating the system in your environment and conditioning yourself to have new responses for certain stimuli. Number 1, what is the first step of how to actually lock in? Well, we're going to base a lot of this on positive psychology. For those of you who don't know what positive psychology is, it's basically the science of an optimal state of consciousness or an optimal life. Right? It's like, it's not the absence of bad, but it's everything above that. What's adding good. That's positive psychology. And part of that is the mind. So how to lock in? There's something called a flow state. A flow state, the term flow was first coined by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He is a psychology researcher and one of the godfathers of cognitive and positive psychology. But he essentially determined that the flow state was an optimal state of consciousness where if you ever have been in the library and you've been locked in and time just kind of flows by, right? You don't really notice that it's gone and you kind of look up, you're like, oh, I got all this work done, right? That's flow, right? You can get it while doing activities like, let's say you were to go on a run, right? You can be in flow. You're just like, the first little bit might be hard, but then, towards the end, you're like, oh, I'm just kind of feeling this, right? Like, yeah, or like you're baking or reading a book and you just kind of get lost in it, right? That's flow. So I'm going to teach you how to get into flow on command here in the next roughly 15, 20 minutes or so. So flow state, first of all, now you know what it is, but how does it work? So the flow state, it comes in something called the flow cycle. The flow cycle looks something like this. Let's say that there's a big wheel. The first stage, this is stage 1 right here, this is going to be the struggle phase. This is where it's pretty hard to do any work. It's when you're sitting down and you're like, I don't want to do this, right? That's the struggle phase. That's where most people get derailed. They never actually get into the rest of the cycle. The struggle phase lasts anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes. But it also could be faster depending on how often you get into flow, because the more often you get into flow, the easier it is to get past the struggle phase. Well, let's say on average it's roughly 10 minutes. The second phase right here is the transition stage. And the transition phase, this is where you go from struggle to the third stage, which I'll cover in just a second. But the transition phase, this is where you'll start to feel the shift, right? If things start to become easier. And it could last anywhere from like a minute to maybe 2-3 minutes, right? You kind of notice that things are kind of fading away, but you're also not like aware enough to really be like, oh my gosh, things are fading away. Next one, this is the flow phase. This is where everything becomes easy. This is the phase you want to be in. This is the slice of the pie that everybody is smiling. In flow phase, the reason you kind of get lost in it, you're like, whoa, I just did all that work, right? When you come out, is because there's something called transient hypofrontality. Transient hypofrontality, well, hypofrontality basically means less hypo, right? Frontality, the frontal lobe. So hypofrontality, downregulation of the frontal lobe. And this whole term, transient hypofrontality, basically means the loss of awareness, of self-awareness, because the self-awareness part comes from the frontal lobe, right? That is your planning, your higher level consciousness. So if you downregulate that, you kind of just lose your sense of self and you're just like locked in, essentially. And one of the fastest ways to get transient hypofrontality is just by walking. You kind of just move and you're like, oh, I've kind of lost, whoa, where'd I go? Oh, I missed a turn, right? It's pretty easy to do because the behavior of walking is so easy, right? And so the goal is one way to make flow easier is to limit the struggle phase is to make whatever you're doing easier. We'll get to that in a minute. Then after that, it's the recovery phase. How long you stay in flow will determine how long your recovery needs to be. Flow, if you practice it, can last up to like 2 hours if you really force it. For me, I've been practicing it for a while. It used to be like 30 minutes. But now I can hold flow for roughly 90 minutes. That's what I do in my block. Yeah, 30 to 90 minutes. Pomodoro technique, a lot of you guys know that. That's 25 minutes on. I think it's 5 minutes off, and then you do that again and again, right? I do something different. My flow phase is it's structured more towards maximizing how much time I spend in flow. I don't want to get out of flow every 25 minutes, right? I'm on a roll. Those extra 15 minutes that I'm doing every
30 minutes, right? The 5, right? If I take out 5 minutes from every 30 minutes, that's an extra 15 minutes of flow. I don't want to get rid of that. Plus, I get the interruption, right? But it depends on your stamina. The longer you are in flow, the longer you practice flow and getting into flow, the easier it is to be in flow and sustain it. And also there's a bunch of things that can help you expand and stretch your capacity. I like to do, for every 90 minutes, I take 30 minutes off and actually go do something fun, go talk to a friend, right? I would do this in the library. What I like to do is 3 by 90-minute W for work, and then 30 minutes recovery. Moving on. Once you have a flow state, then what do? Well, there's flow triggers, right? And I told you we get into this in a bit. Well, what are flow triggers? Flow triggers are pretty much anything that helps you get into a flow state. And we talked about making it easier, right? The struggle phase, how to shorten the struggle phase. By the way, if you want more information on flow, there is a free PDF that breaks down all of this in a ton of detail and shows you exactly how to implement it step by step into a daily routine, why things work, how things work, and how to actually apply it to your life. You can go download it for free at UofTearless.com. It comes with an audiobook too, because I want people to know how to focus, because it was so hard for me to focus with ADHD, and I don't want you guys to go through that. So I made that for free. I also made a bunch of other free ebooks. And then to apply this to your actual study system, there's also my full video series on how to study that you can go implement it with that. But this is gonna make all studying easier. So go download that free ebook. Anyway, flow triggers, let's get back right to it. All right, what's the first flow trigger? Probably the easiest thing on earth that none of you do. Everybody says you love it, but none of you do it. What is it? Sleep. Right? Sleep. Just sleep more. Right? The more you sleep, the more neurological activity you have, the easier it is to bypass the struggle phase. What is the second one? Well, it's probably one that you already do and you're probably addicted to it, and it's caffeine. So sleep and caffeine, those are your two biggest ones. There are a bunch of other ones that a lot of you don't realize, and one of them is something called chrononutrition. Chrononutrition, so this is in terms of supplements, but chrononutrition is the science of the timing of food. So basically, your body runs on biological systems. These systems have different timings. You've probably heard of the circadian rhythm for sleep, but there's also other rhythms like the ultradian rhythm, right? So all of your different body systems run on different clocks. Some happen more than once a day, some happen less than once a day. Sleep, it's once a day, right? Your circadian rhythm. So that circadian rhythm, by the way, does not just refer to sleep. It refers to anything that happens on a daily basis. And then there was one other thing, which is hydration. The more hydrated you are, the easier it is to bypass the struggle phase. Basically, you want to put your body in an optimal state of amazingness. These are the 4 main flow triggers, but there are also a few other ones, right? In terms of supplements, you can also have something like beta-alanine, citrulline malate. There's also L-theanine. By the way, L-theanine, if you take it with caffeine, it has the ability to minimize the jitteriness effect and actually help caffeine last longer. So, you want to take this L-theanine in a 2-to-1 ratio here with caffeine. So if caffeine, let's say you have like 30 milligrams, then you would want to have 60 mg of L-theanine. Beta-alanine, it's basically a vasodilator. It helps, anything that helps promote blood flow to the brain. So vasodilator, it expands your blood vessels, right? It's going to feel a little tingly. A lot of people use it for pre-workout, but I also use it to focus. I take it before my midterms and finals. By the way, I also have my full 1-hour pre-exam protocol to get into a flow state as easy as possible on the exam. So if you want that, it's free. Go check that out. UofTearless.com. And citrulline malate is another one that helps promote, the cardiovascular system. So more blood flow. After the flow triggers, what do? Well, now you have the flow application and timing. You have the flow timing. This is probably the most important one because there are certain times of the day. Well, one, it's just when you do it in the day, but 2, how you structure it in the day, right? That's a huge component of flow. So timing flow is essential to being able to maximize the duration of it and the ease of getting into it. So it could technically be classified as another flow trigger if you put it in at the right time. That you could just do it as like temporal training, I guess, just like training yourself to get into flow at certain times of the day, which actually I've kind of done, but not on purpose, just because it's easier to focus, so I do it more at that time, and then as a result, it gets easier and easier to get into flow at that time, and then later in the day, it gets harder and harder. How do you do this? What's the optimal timing? Well, we kind of covered a little bit of it here, right? The first thing is you want to get into flow when
you have the most energy? This depends on genetics, right? Some people are naturally morning people. Some people are naturally nighttime people, like larks, right? A lark is a term for anyone who's more of a nighttime person. Their circadian rhythm is shifted more towards the night, or they want to be awake a little bit later, wake up a little bit later, right? I cannot do that, but some people, they do, right? So yeah, that depends on when you have the most energy, you want to make sure that you're maximizing that. The second thing is what you eat in the morning, right? There is nothing special about waking up early, but there is absolutely something special about working after your longest uninterrupted period of sleep. So whether that's in the morning or later in the afternoon, right? You basically just want to get up and work immediately because why? The brain waves of sleep are very similar to the brain waves of flow. So if you work in something that's pretty similar, it's pretty easy to transition, right? If you eat fat, your body has a easier time storing the fat as opposed to protein, where it has to convert it and do all this energy and then store it as fat, right? It's pretty hard to do. So yeah, that has to do with when you wake up, basically wake up and work as soon as possible. The second thing, right, after you work after waking, this is the second rule that I have. This kind of goes into chrononutrition a little bit here, and it's to work fasted but hydrated. Why fasted? Well, because when you divert blood to the stomach to digest food, it takes it away from the brain. You're not as focused, right? And actually what you eat will have a huge impact. We talked about chrononutrition, not just timing, but also what you eat, high flow foods. Those are things that are generally like, if you ever eaten a ton of carbs and you get really sleepy, it's not because carbs are bad for you, it's just because you get a carb crash, right? You don't want to work. So what I'll do if I don't eat anything first, like if I have to eat something because I have something to do after it, like let's say I have morning practice for the rowing team, right? I'll just eat yogurt. And then as soon as I'm walking out the door, I'll just have a couple toaster waffles on the way out, right? But the yogurt is not going to have a huge spike in insulin, which means that I can focus pretty well. So yeah, that's like one of the examples. I would go look at the flow PDF if you want to know what's a high flow food, what's not a high flow food. But yeah, so work fasted and hydrate, because again, hydration, it makes the struggle phase much easier to bypass, get into the transition phase, flow phase. Okay, so work fasted but hydrated. And then the second caveat to this is have caffeine as long as it's 1.5 hours after you wake up, 90 minutes after waking. Okay, people have probably told you to wait to have caffeine before, and you're probably like, yeah, okay, sure, but like why, right? Well, the reason why is because when you wake, you naturally, your cortisol rises, and the receptors in your brain that cause you to feel tired, they get taken up by cortisol first. So you actually don't want to slam it with caffeine, because then all the cortisol will just be there, right? And like you naturally have this boost, and so use it, right? You naturally have the cortisol boost to block the tiredness receptors. Then you throw caffeine in there too. Once the cortisol has kind of been transported away, the caffeine comes in, then it kicks in, boom, you're not tired again. Right? So you have basically 2 rounds of caffeine, but one of them is natural and you don't need to do anything. So that's why you wait. And the problem is if you take caffeine too early, it just sits there. It doesn't actually do anything. But be careful, because if you're in a fasted phase, it's going to have a much greater effect. I would start with like half of your dose, see how you feel within like 20 minutes. And then if you feel good, you can have a little bit more and just keep adding it in. Then after like 3 or 4 days, you'll know, okay, this is how much I can have in the morning. But also, what I would recommend for caffeine, you want to have a break. I know none of you are going to do this, but I'm going to tell you to do it anyway. Every 3rd day, so 1 out of 3 days, take no caffeine break. And then there's also, for the longer extended times, it also kind of goes with your work cycles in the year. But I would definitely go read the Flow PDF, but it's basically going to tell you how to do this to make it effective as possible. So once per week, just have a day with no caffeine. It's going to suck, but just throw it in on like a Saturday or a Sunday when you don't have anything to do, because it's going to make caffeine way more effective. And the last thing, final part, is that you want to structure your flow blocks. And I'll explain what this means. By the way, guys, before we go into this, I just want to let you know that I do have a full video series that explains exactly how I study. So this tells you how to get locked into study, but I do have a full video course if you want to know how I study 2 hours a day and still breeze through all my exams while taking a full course load. then definitely go check that out. It's on UofTearless.com. Just type in UofTearless.com or use the link in the description. I basically made it so that the first year version of myself would never have to look for any other thing again. It is exactly step by step. I even made example lectures that show you exactly how to apply all of the principles. And if you want a more general overview to know what that's like, to make sure that you actually want to use the system that I use, there is another video that I will link in the description where it basically goes over the full framework that I use to study. And if you want more in depth on that, if you like it, go check it out on my website, the full video series, which is like 30 videos or something like that. And basically, you watch that, you'll never have to struggle in school again. So let's get into this flow blocking here. What is flow blocking? Well, flow blocking basically means when you structure your flow blocks. A flow block would be 90-minute window, 30-minute window, whatever it is. But you want to make sure that you don't do too many at once, because if you're just starting out, you're new to flow, then it is very hard to sustain, right? So there are neurotransmitters in your brain that allow you to get into flow, but you can exhaust them a lot faster when you're not used to having that. There's something called long-term potentiation, which basically means there are more connections of neurons in your brain and stronger connections, and they produce more neurotransmitters, the signals from neurons. So there are more of them, and they're stronger, and on the other side, it's more receptive, right? And so all of these things allow you to stay in flow longer with the longer you do it. It's like exercising a muscle, right? The more you do it, the stronger it gets. So if you're just starting out, you don't want to try to bench press 225 because you're probably just going to get crushed, right? You don't want to try to do a 90-minute block if you've never done flow before, because 30 minutes might be your max, 20 minutes might be your max. Like when I started out, I could barely focus for like 10 minutes. I was like, 10 minutes out, this is great. Like I used to just sit in the library for 8 hours and probably study for 1. If you're just starting out, this is what I'm gonna recommend. Pomodoro technique, I don't usually recommend it, but fine. Pomodoro technique, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. The reason I don't recommend it is because I think you can do a lot longer than that, and most people can, and then the timer goes off and they're like, oh man, I was actually in flow, that was pretty good, and then they have trouble getting back into it, right? So this is going to help you get into flow. Once you're in flow, it's pretty easy to sustain as long as you don't get distracted. So if you're working with friends, only work with friends who don't talk to you, or work with only one person, because if you're not talking, they can't talk. Over time, you're going to increase this, and you might even need to increase this, or you could keep it the same. I've even done times where I've done like 45 minutes on. This is one I really liked when I was kind of intermediate with flow, 45 minutes on, and then I would do 5 minutes off. And I would just cycle that twice. If you're a morning person like me, then I would do 2 flow cycles back to back in the morning, wait a little bit, do another one midday, 1, 2 p.m. You're probably gonna be tapped out if you're new, okay? If you are a nighttime person, maybe 1 right after you wake up. Just try to knock out some work and then save the hard stuff for later in the day when you're just, you really gotta gnarl it in. So that is how I go about blocking flow. This is the science behind actually locking in, getting into a flow state, getting that transient hypofrontality, getting so locked in that you forget that everything else exists and the work just continues. If you like this video, subscribe, let me know down in the comments.
I just got out of a midterm, and I'm going to tell you the exact strategy that I used to learn half of the content in the span of an hour. There's something that you need to understand about memory, and it's that if memory has been consolidated in terms of like putting something into long-term memory, then they actually don't fade. You simply lose access to it. And the only thing that you need to do to retrieve this memory is to stimulate the memory engram. An engram is essentially the group of neurons that are holding a certain memory. So when a memory is mapped onto something like the neurons, that is called the memory engram. To stimulate the memory engram, you need something called a memory cue. Now, you don't necessarily need a full memory cue. You can also get something called a partial memory cue. And the reason I'm explaining this is because the way that the brain works in terms of testing and when you're going into an exam is that the exam question itself is going to serve as a memory cue. Now, depending on the type of exam that you have, whether it's multiple choice, they're more focused on recall, and then you have the long answer questions, which are more focused on long elaborations and arguments. So the exam that I just got out of was 6 short answer questions. They weren't full essays, so that's why I say they're short answer, but they did take up a full page. The way I studied for this exam, and not knowing, I had been to lecture, but one of them I actually missed as well, and so it actually worked for lectures that you might miss as well, is I threw all of that information into Google Gemini, and I had Google Gemini generate me 2 full-length practice exams for the lecture that I missed, and then 2 for all of the lectures that were covered in this midterm. And so the midterm was a non-cumulative midterm. It was the second one, but the final is cumulative. For this second exam, what I did was I had Gemini generate 2 full-length practice exams for just the second half of the course. And in doing this, I found that 3, it gets repetitive, and 1, it's not enough. You're missing half of the concepts. So you really do need 2. And then I also had it do 2 just for that 1 lecture. And in going through this, you really start to understand the information, not just as memorization from flashcards or making mind maps of it, which takes a long time, is you can actually just have Google Gemini spit out essentially a partially made mind map for you, and then you can just memorize those answers. You don't necessarily need to fully memorize them either. You can just memorize, like if it were a pathway or something, you can have it be, okay, Krebs is phosphorylated by, let's say, the LTP inducing stimulus, and then that phosphorylation triggers the translation of CEBP beta, something like that, right? You just know the specific points you need to hit in each answer, and then the question itself will actually serve as a memory cue. And the reason it's not going to be an exact memory cue is because the question's probably going to be worded slightly differently, but in this exam, there were actually 3 questions that were fairly similar. And so the similar question serves as a partial memory cue. So there's something called hippocampal indexing theory, which states that the hippocampus is needed for the retrieval of context-rich memory. And then over time, the neocortex becomes less reliant on the hippocampus, and it can start retrieving memories that are general by itself. And so if you have a partial cue, it will serve to stimulate part of the neocortical engram, right? Remember the sequence of neurons that memory was mapped onto, which will then go back to stimulate the hippocampus to stimulate the rest of the engram. And that's why a partial cue can also work. And so the question that is slightly similar to the question that I had on my practice exams, those served as partial cues for the answer of the question that I had, which was the engram. And so in doing this, you actually pretty much conditioning yourself to answer questions that these questions will serve as memory cues for the answers. And you might be thinking, well, this is pretty obvious, right? You're just memorizing answers to specific questions. Well, the difference here lies in the fact that you can actually understand things from more perspectives than the questions will actually ask you on the test. And so what I found and have done over the past semester is that I will take a certain lecture, just any lecture that I'm having trouble with, I will first throw it into Google Gemini, have it generate me the practice exam, know how I'm supposed to understand the information, and then go make flashcards on it, then go make mind maps on it, because it saves so much time, and I actually know what's important to make flashcards on, and I can make better flashcards because I understand it from the perspective of the exam and how it's actually supposed to be answered in terms of, they're probably going to ask me about it in this way. I need to understand it and explain this part of the concept. This is what's more important. And when you get really good at it, which I have done over the past semester, you can pretty much do this in the span of like 30 minutes per lecture. And so I learned 2 lectures in the span of an hour, and then reviewed the whole thing in the next like 10-15 minutes. And I can keep also a lot in short-term memory. So this is another aspect. This is the second aspect. And the short-term memory is going to be huge in terms of allowing you to cram a bunch of things in that you don't necessarily have stored in long-term memory, but they can still serve as partial cues for your long-term memory. And so the way that I do this is to maximize the amount of stuff I can fit in short-term memory, because short-term memory can only fit about 5 to 7 items. I will make mnemonics, which will then store multiple items in one item, and I will create those mnemonics with meaning so that it's even more meaningful, and I will write them down as soon as I get into the exam. And then I will just have, like, I don't even touch the Scantron sheet, I don't touch anything, I just write all of this down immediately right when I get to the exam on a scrap sheet of paper. And then once I'm done writing it on the scrap sheet of paper, then I will look at the questions. If the questions spark anything else, I will then go write it down on the scrap sheet of paper. Only then will I try to think about which questions are going to be the hardest to answer and which questions are going to be the easiest to answer. I start with the easy ones. It gets the mind going. Then I will do, I'll usually go from front to back and then from back to front to review the answers and make up any questions that I had trouble with along the way. So I answered the first 3 questions on this exam, and then I had trouble with the 4th one, so I skipped and went to the 5th one, answered half of the 6th one, went back to the 4th one, answered the 4th one, and then went and finished the 6th one. In doing this, you get more and more contexts to stimulate your memory, you get more partial cues, you get more cues, and you end up being able to remember more because you also have all of the context of everything that you remember from blurting it out as soon as you get to the exam. And so all of a sudden you have this bank of stuff that you might know in theory, but you don't know in practice, ready, written there. It also saves you a ton of time. And so then you don't have to think when your brain gets tired of like, oh, I forgot like all these things. Like I knew this pathway in the beginning of the exam, but now I didn't have it written down. You have it written down, it serves as a memory cue for other things, and it acts as the context. Think of it as like a mind map, right? You want to fill in the gaps of the mind map. These arguments, whatever, these pieces of evidence, they now serve as cues for you to write your questions and just fill in the gaps. And it makes it so much easier. It's a much, much more efficient approach to actually doing your exam than to simply just try to memorize a ton of bullet points and things like that. Go get the questions, memorize the things in terms of the questions, know the order of what you're going to say, the points. That's the most important thing. And so for like, if I were to have a paragraph that I have to memorize, then I would simply memorize the order of what I'm going to say, but in the context of a mnemonic. So I would make it maybe like cows if I was going to remember like C amp, and then like just a random word like oscillations, and then like work factor. It's not actually a thing, but like something like that, where if the question asked something about like, let's say like grass, or had like something with a G, so like G coupled protein receptor. This isn't like actually real, but like G coupled protein receptor, oh, grass, okay, cow, okay, now I remember. And then you go in and you answer, hit all those points. But the thing is, you can just write on your scrap sheet of paper cow and grass, and then before you forget, you write that out, so now it's there, boom. Okay, now I'm not going to forget that, the mnemonic. Now I just need to remember what the mnemonic stands for, which is much easier to do. And then you do that over and over again, so you just have a bunch of mnemonics or a bunch of pathways, or like when I'm writing a pathway, I'll literally just write the first letter of everything and then fill in everything afterwards if I'm storing it in short-term memory, because it's too much to just write out each word. I'll forget the next word by the time I've written it out. And so that's a way to really boost how much you can put into short-term memory, just mnemonics and meaning and the actual application of words. If you haven't stored it in long-term memory, you can just use structural chunking, which is essentially what I described of learning the mnemonics, uppercase letters, maybe just write the first letter first, know what that structure looks like, and then you can fill in the gaps later. And so if you take this approach, you will learn a lot faster. It's not necessarily the best thing to do, but if you are struggling to cram for an exam, this is the way I would do it. Just have Gemini or whatever your favorite LLM, have it generate 2 full-length practice exams for whatever lectures you're struggling with most, and then 2 for overall, the whole amount of content that you're going to be asked. Because the way that LLMs work is that they make predictions based on what's most likely. And so they will actually be very good at predicting what questions are going to be asked on the exam, because they're doing it by chance. And whatever is covered in the most detail on the lectures, or whatever you wrote in your notes, because it can read your handwriting if it's good enough, or if you just type your notes, it's even better, then it will actually be able to predict like the majority of the questions that are going to be on the test. And that's actually what happened to me. Like 4 out of the 6 questions were pretty much exactly what I had in the practice, and I did this like 2 hours before, and then I took like a 30-minute break beforehand. It was very, very similar. And then the other questions were just different short answer questions that I could infer from, by connecting it to the previous questions, because I had way more questions in the practice than I did on the exam. And you can kind of mix and match different components, and you don't need to get every component right. You just need to get the structure down, and then you can fill in the gaps.
And you are much more likely to get it right that way than to try to get it perfect in a row. Like, I need to say this sentence perfectly, then this sentence, then this sentence. Just like on the scrap sheet of paper, be like, I'm probably going to talk about this, then I forget what comes here, but then I'm going to write this. Oh, okay, it was this. And then you go and fill it in. You actually write it down.